Jimmy Page stopped concert after racist slur. What he did next changed rock history. Birmingham, England, November 1973. The air inside Birmingham Town Hall was thick with tension that had nothing to do with the screaming fans or the heat from the stage lights. This was post-colonial Britain, just as Caribbean and South Asian immigrants were changing the face of English cities. And Jimmy Page was about to walk on stage with 3 Jamaican musicians as special guests. Some people in that crowd of 3,000 had come to see Led Zeppelin. Others had come to make a statement. Halfway through Black Dog, it happened. A voice from the darkness hurled a racial slur so vile that the entire band stopped playing. The music died. The crowd fell silent. And in that moment, Jimmy Page had to choose between his career and doing what was right. What happened next would make headlines across Britain and change the lives of those 3 musicians forever. If this story of moral courage and standing up for what's right moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. We bring you the untold stories behind rock's greatest legends. To understand what happened that night in Birmingham, you have to understand the Britain of 1973. The Windrush generation had arrived from the Caribbean in the 1940s and 50s, invited to help rebuild post-war Britain. But by the early 1970s, racial tensions were escalating. Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968 had inflamed anti-immigrant sentiment. The National Front was gaining support. Cities like Birmingham, with large Caribbean populations, had become flashpoints for racial conflict. Birmingham itself wasn't just any English city. It was an industrial heartland where Caribbean immigrants had come to work in the factories, where different cultures were colliding in ways both beautiful and violent. The local music scene reflected this tension, with reggae and ska influences creeping into British rock, creating new sounds that some embraced and others resented. Jimmy Page had always occupied a complex position in rock music's racial politics. Like many British guitarists, he had built his style on American blues, music created by black artists in the Mississippi Delta and Chicago clubs. But unlike some of his contemporaries, Jimmy had been increasingly vocal about acknowledging those influences, about paying respect to the masters who had come before. In late 1973, during Led Zeppelin's British tour, Jimmy had made the controversial decision to invite 3 Jamaican musicians to join selected shows as special guests. Winston Riley on percussion, Lloyd Parks on bass, and Robbie Shakespeare on additional guitar. These weren't anonymous session players. They were established artists in their own right, veterans of the Kingston studio scene who had worked with Bob Marley, Jimmy Cliff, and other reggae legends. The collaboration had emerged from Jimmy's growing fascination with Caribbean rhythms. He'd been studying reggae and ska, trying to understand how those syncopated beats could blend with rock's power chords. The Jamaican musicians, for their part, were intrigued by the possibility of reaching new audiences, of showing that their music could speak to anyone willing to listen. When the collaboration was announced, reactions were immediate and polarized. Progressive music journalists praised Jimmy's openness to new influences. Conservative critics questioned why British rock needed foreign elements. Some fans were excited by the musical possibilities. Others saw it as a betrayal of rock's supposed purity. The 3 Jamaican musicians had mixed feelings about touring through England. They had experienced British racism before, knew its particular flavor of polite dismissal mixed with occasional violent hostility. Before the tour started, they had discussed how to handle potential incidents, whether to ignore hecklers, whether to respond, what to do if things became dangerous. The Birmingham show had been tense from the moment doors opened. As fans filed into the historic town hall, there were visible pockets of discomfort. Older attendees who seemed surprised to see black musicians prominently featured. younger fans wearing National Front badges, skinheads who'd come looking for trouble. But there were also plenty of people genuinely excited about the musical fusion they were about to witness. Security had been increased for the Birmingham stop, not because of any specific threat, but because everyone involved understood this was potentially volatile. Backstage, Jimmy had been unusually quiet during the pre-show routine. Band members later recalled that he seemed more serious than usual, less prone to his typical dry humor and nervous energy. The Jamaican musicians went through their usual warm-ups, trying to treat this like any other show, even though they knew it wasn't. They could feel the tension through the venue walls, the electricity of a crowd that contained both excitement and hostility. The first half of the concert went smoothly. Led Zeppelin opened with their usual high-energy numbers, and the crowd responded enthusiastically. When Jimmy introduced the special guests, there was applause mixed with some audible grumbling. The fusion worked beautifully from a musical standpoint. Winston's percussion added new textures to familiar songs. Lloyd's bass lines created rhythmic patterns that made people move differently. Robbie's guitar work complemented Jimmy's in ways that surprised everyone. By the time they reached Black Dog, one of Led Zeppelin's most popular songs, everything seemed to be going perfectly. The crowd was engaged, the musical chemistry was undeniable, and Jimmy appeared to be enjoying himself immensely. They were about 2/3 through the song, building toward its thunderous climax, when everything changed in an instant. A voice from somewhere in the middle section of the hall, amplified by a momentary lull in the music, cut through the sound with a racial slur directed at the three Jamaican musicians. The words were clear enough that everyone in the venue heard them. In the immediate aftermath, time seemed to slow down. Jimmy had been mid-solo when he heard it, and his hands simply froze on the fretboard. The guitar feedback died away. Robert Plant's voice trailed off. John Paul Jones stopped playing bass. John Bonham's drums fell silent. The three Jamaican musicians stood at their positions, their faces showing a mixture of hurt, anger, and what looked like weary familiarity. This wasn't their first encounter with British racism, but it was perhaps the most public. The rest of Led Zeppelin were looking at Jimmy, uncertain whether to keep playing or stop. 3,000 people were suddenly silent, the collective intake of breath creating a sound like wind through trees before everything went quiet. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed for decades. Jimmy didn't consult with his band, didn't look to his manager in the wings, didn't pause to calculate the professional consequences of what he was about to do. He walked to the front of the stage, his face showing an anger that people who knew him recognized as rare and serious. The spotlight operators, uncertain what was happening, kept the lights trained on him as he picked up the microphone and spoke in a voice that was controlled but shaking with fury. "Stop right there," Jimmy said. Though he wasn't shouting, the words carried to every corner of the hall. "We're not going to continue until something is made clear here." The silence was absolute now. 3,000 people holding their breath. "I heard what was just said. A lot of you heard it too. And I want everyone in this hall to understand something right now." He turned and gestured toward the three Jamaican musicians, who were standing motionless at their instruments. "These gentlemen are not just my special guests. They are not just here to add some exotic flavor to our sound. These men are masters. They are my teachers. They have shown me rhythms I never knew existed, harmonies I never imagined possible." Jimmy's voice grew stronger and more passionate with each sentence. "The music you love, the music Led Zeppelin plays, it comes from their heritage. The blues came from African rhythms brought to America by enslaved people. Rock and roll was created by Black Americans, and now these musicians are showing us new possibilities, new ways to make music that speaks to the soul." Jimmy paused, letting his words sink in, and when he spoke again, his next statement would be quoted in newspapers across Britain the next day. These men are not just part of this show. They are the show. And more importantly, they are human beings who deserve respect. Now, I can see the exit doors from here. They're not hard to find. If you can't give these musicians the respect they deserve, if you can't listen to them play without hate in your heart, then I invite you to leave right now. Because we're not going to continue until everyone here understands that this stage, this music, it belongs to all of us. Not just to people who look like me. The silence that followed Jimmy's words was deafening. For what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, nobody moved. This was the moment of maximum danger. Jimmy had drawn a line, had made it clear that he was willing to sacrifice the show for principle. Then someone started clapping. Then more people joined. Within seconds, the majority of the 3,000-person audience was on their feet, applauding, some cheering, some crying. The three Jamaican musicians, who had been frozen in shock during Jimmy's speech, were now embracing each other, tears visible on their faces. But this wasn't a unanimous response. There were sections of the hall where people remained seated, arms crossed, faces showing anger at what they had just heard. And there was movement toward the exits as perhaps 100 people decided to leave rather than accept what Jimmy had demanded. Security later reported that the departure of those fans was tense, with some shouting insults as they left, others arguing with companions who wanted to stay. There was at least one scuffle near the main entrance. But the vast majority of the audience remained. And as the last of the dissenting fans filtered out, something remarkable happened. Someone in the crowd began clapping a rhythm, the distinctive syncopated beat that had become associated with reggae music. Others joined in, creating a percussion ensemble from 3,000 pairs of hands. Jimmy stood on that stage, visibly moved, as he listened to the crowd create music together. The three Jamaican musicians smiled for the first time that evening, recognizing the rhythm their culture had given to the world. Instead of returning to Black Dog where they had left off, Jimmy made a decision that would change the rest of the show. He turned to Winston, Lloyd, and Robbie and asked them what they wanted to play. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how Led Zeppelin shows were structured. But this wasn't a normal show anymore. Winston stepped forward, conferred briefly with the other two men, and then said something to Jimmy that the audience couldn't hear. Jimmy nodded, walked to Robert Plant, and gave instructions. What happened next was unprecedented in Led Zeppelin's performing career. Jimmy stepped back from center stage and gave the three Jamaican musicians the spotlight for a full song. Not as background to Led Zeppelin's lead, but as the featured performers. They played Many Rivers to Cross, the Jimmy Cliff classic about struggle and perseverance. And they played it with everything they had, pouring out emotions that had been building for years of facing prejudice, years of having their culture appropriated without credit, years of being treated as less than they were. Jimmy stood behind them during that performance, occasionally adding soft guitar lines, but mostly just listening, letting them have the moment. The crowd listened in hushed, reverent silence. This felt more like church than entertainment, more like witnessing something sacred than watching a show. When the three musicians finished, the standing ovation lasted for several minutes, and Lloyd Parks later said it was the most powerful moment of his entire career. The rest of the concert had a different quality than a typical Led Zeppelin show. The energy was more subdued, but somehow more meaningful. Jimmy introduced each of the Jamaican musicians by name and gave brief tributes to their contributions to music. He told stories between songs about learning to play guitar, about the records that had influenced him, about understanding that all music was connected. The immediate aftermath of the Birmingham concert was complex. News of what had happened spread quickly through word of mouth and local media coverage. The headline in the next day's Birmingham Post read, "Page takes stand on race at concert." Within days, the story had been picked up by national newspapers. For Jimmy personally, there were professional consequences. Several venues quietly canceled future bookings. Some radio stations reduced their Led Zeppelin rotation. Letters poured into the band's management offices, about 70% supportive, 30% hostile. But there were positive consequences too. The three Jamaican musicians found their profiles elevated significantly. They were invited for interviews, profiled in music magazines, and offered opportunities that might not have come their way otherwise. Within the music industry, Jimmy's stand had ripple effects. Other rock musicians began speaking more openly about their debt to black music. Venues began implementing clearer policies about acceptable behavior. For Jimmy himself, Birmingham crystallized something that had been forming for years. He had always been uncomfortable with rock music's tendency to ignore its roots. After that night, he began speaking more openly about musical debt, using his platform to recommend black artists, to push back against narratives of white innovation. The story of the Birmingham concert became legendary in music circles. How Jimmy Page had stopped a show to confront racism. How he had given the stage to three Jamaican musicians. How he had chosen principle over profit. It's a story about courage, about using privilege responsibly, about understanding that music belongs to everyone. Jimmy didn't end racism that night. But he drew a line, made a statement, showed that some things matter more than applause or album sales. On November 15, 1973, in Birmingham, England, Jimmy Page had to choose between his comfort and his conscience. He chose conscience. He stood with three Jamaican musicians who were being disrespected and said clearly, "If you disrespect them, you disrespect the music itself." The three men standing behind him that night never forgot it. The fans who stayed and cheered never forgot it. And 50 years later, we're still talking about what happened in that hall, still trying to understand what it meant. That's the power of moral courage. It reverberates beyond the immediate moment, creating ripples that spread farther than anyone could predict. Jimmy Page made a lot of music in his lifetime, but that night in Birmingham, he made history. If this story inspired you, please subscribe for more untold stories of rock legends who use their platform to make a difference. Hit that like button if you believe music has the power to unite us all.